All right. Hello, everyone. This is Trip. I'm here with Nick, and we're joined by the one and only John Garth. So thank you for it's evening for you, afternoon for us, but thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Still pretty bright. Summer evenings in England, as you know, go on for quite a long time. So
Oh yeah, now is like the time when I was living in Edinburgh that the kids go to bed and you still have 3 hours of sunlight. And
or the Northern Lights, maybe if you're lucky.
yes, it is. It was quite the shell shock if you're not used to it. When you're like, wow, it's 11 o'clock, and I didn't even need to turn on the porch lights to sit in the hot tub.
Right.
Well, we're glad you're here. Nick, why don't you set things up for us? Like introduce people to John and things. And before we dig into the stuff we talked about, there are a few questions people sent me that I was like, literally, John Garth is the greatest person to ask. So yeah.
Okay, so I think most of you know, but we've got the man, the myth, the legend himself, John Garth. The maybe the greatest Tolkien historian currently alive, uh, author of Tolkien and the Great War, and recently The Places That Inspired Middle Earth, and Tolkien at Exeter College. John Garth also has a bunch of his work online that you can go and support. John, could you remind us what that platform is where people can go and support your work as well?
It's called Steady, so it's a bit like Patreon, and you just look up steadyhq.com and John Garth, and you'll get to my page. So yeah, the idea is to raise funds to help me as a non-salaried freelance writer, to spend more time writing rather than trying to earn money by other ways, like by editing, which doesn't contribute anything to the world's understanding of Tolkien at all. So
Well,
Yeah,
other
go
than
give John Garth your
appreciated
money.
editing, yeah.
I'm sorry.
And the links for it will be on the resource page underneath the video. So if you're watching it from there, you can grab it. But if you're in the Facebook group watching or on YouTube after the live session, if you head over the resource page, you'll see the link, so you can click through and support what John's up to.
I would add it's early days yet, so I'm still formulating what I can do for people without it becoming a project in itself, which takes too much time away from research and writing. So try it out. Stay tuned.
Awesome. So there were a couple questions that came in just before that might be worth talking about Tolkien more specifically before we talk about your own relationship with Tolkien. And last night in our conversation with Alan Sisto, one of the things that came up with it, we got a couple questions around was how did Tolkien understand the creation of his own legendarium? That we talked a lot around it of like developing this thick, rich, deep account of Middle Earth that has creation stories and all these kinds of things running through it. But having spent so much time with Tolkien, like what tell us the origin story of the legendarium, and then what it was that drove him and gave him so much passion for developing such a thick world to think and play and write and discover in.
Well, how long do we have? But no, I mean, in a nutshell, it seems to have been a case that Tolkien he started out writing essentially as a way of amusing people, amusing school friends, amusing college friends, and as he was doing so, he wrote parodically. So he wrote parodies of heroic poetry. He wrote parodies of epic writing, for like the school magazine or for his college undergraduate debating society. And then he was encouraged to try writing serious poetry by one of his close friends, Geoffrey Bache Smith of the now rather famous TCBS. And then the war came along, the First World War, 1914, and it seems to have given Tolkien something of a jolt, emotionally and imaginatively, very crucially. So his writing, his creativity grew with the war in which his generation was engulfed, and his writing became, as I've argued in Tolkien and the Great War, a mirror, a reflection, a response to everything that was going on at the time, not just his personal experience of going into war, though this very much counts in parts of what became the Silmarillion and in The Hobbit, and especially in The Lord of the Rings, but also simply the scale of the thing. You know, writing a cosmic legendarium is a way of responding to something that's absolutely global and absolutely mind-boggling, mind-expanding, potentially mind-crushing. In terms of how Tolkien saw his creativity himself, well, as I say, he did regard himself as a performer. So I think that's a key thing to his achievement, that he was a real perfectionist. He liked to, he obviously had a gift, he had a knack for writing extremely engagingly and for story, for generating story. But he would hone it so that it was as effective as possible. And so, as we know, he was very keen on inner consistency. So he creates a world that is very persuasive in that sense, in a rational as well as an emotional sense. And the two things, I think, gel very well together. But he was also someone who depended on inspiration. So at times you can see that there are long gaps in his productivity as a writer. Mainly, I think, because he's distracted by other things, if you can call it distraction when it's actually his day job, you know, or his night job. So being a university academic or being a family man, he had to squeeze creating Middle-earth between those things. And then, you know, he would work very late into the night, and he would have periods of exhaustion or even close times that were close to mental breakdown. You can read it in his letters. And what often happens, strangely enough, is that he would emerge from periods of illness one way or another. For example, the illness trench fever that he came down with after the Battle of the Somme in the First World War in 1916. Or a breakdown in the summer of 1938, he would emerge from these and suddenly be capable of pouring out an immense and intense piece of writing. The Fall of Gondolin would be one. The Music of the Ainur, the Ainur Lindale, the Silmarillion, both of those 1917, so quite soon after the Battle of the Somme. The Bombadil chapters of The Lord of the Rings after that near breakdown in 1938. So he really did rely on some kind of inspiration, and he didn't know where that came from. So, you know, this could be a theological debate. He sometimes seemed to indicate that he thought that this was a kind of divine gift. I mean, this is what you see in Leaf by Niggle, when Niggle the painter is painting this immense and unfinished picture of a tree, which is Tolkien's allegory for his own work. And after his death, he passes on into the afterlife and discovers his tree alive, complete, but never complete because it's still growing. And he says it's a gift. I would argue that a lot of Tolkien's inspirations also came from the events of the world around him, the pressures he was under. And they were, if you like, gifted responses to crises, ways of dramatizing the crisis, perhaps working it through emotionally and logically and cathartically. And or perhaps simply taking something terrible and creating something beautiful from it, which in itself is an amazing feeling. It's something I've never written anything remotely like The Lord of the Rings, let me say. and who among us have? But I used to write lyrics or poetry at one time, and this was a way quite often of me getting out my 20s, when I was generally single. Quite often a way of me getting over misery moments when I was in cases of unrequited love or whatever. And this stuff, it could sometimes just pour out of me, and like an hour later with a bit of tinkering, I'd look at it and I think, wow, an hour ago I was just as miserable as I thought I could be, and now I've created something that delights me. So that in itself is a quite cathartic, quite an emotional boost to create from chaos.
Yeah. So that's actually, I mean, you didn't even know what people messaged in last night, but Mark asked, how did Tolkien understand the relationship of creator to creature within Middle Earth, and then how did that connect to his own understanding of creation as an artist?
Yeah, so he talked about his legendarium as a secondary world, made by a sub-creator within the primary world made by a creator, as he believed. And he argued that this thing that he called sub-creativity, sub-creation, was a kind of fragment of the divine. It was us making ourselves in the image of the creator, or the creator making ourselves in his own image as sub-creators. So that's that works extremely well as a kind of theological creative model. I would have thought, to my eye, it does. I hesitate myself to use the word sub-creation because that suggests that I'm that I see that model working myself, and as I think I don't, because I don't believe in God.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect transition, just because, in our last talk with Tolkien heads, you kind of brought that up and talked about Tolkien being a conduit of wisdom for you, and talked about how Tolkien was kind of that person in his works that shaped your values and influence, the things that you find to be worth pursuing in those ways. And so, of course, many of us have different conduits, whether it's religious, cultural, etc. Could you further unpack your experience of Tolkien as a conduit for wisdom in your life, among others, and explain why Tolkien serves as one of the conduits for you?
Well, I'm glad you sent me this question in advance, because I had to do some real thinking about it. And it's you could almost write a book on the subject if I was that self-obsessed, because obviously everyone has a kind of journey that they undergo in the construction of themselves, and I would say that Tolkien is perhaps the major, well, I say perhaps, certainly the major contributor, but there's a whole series of things, and I would say that the start of it all was when I was 6, and I watched a television program called the Wombles. Right. So these are kind of creative, imaginative, adventurous, ingenious eco bunnies that live under Wimbledon Common in England, and they go around collecting litter. So they collect junk, garbage, and they take it back to their burrow and they make things out of it. So they make useful things out of stuff that we think is useless. So that's a sort of really entertaining, very, very funny, quite moving at times, these stories. When I got on to reading the novels by someone called Elizabeth Beresford. So so that kind of set the tone, I suppose, for my interest in stories that were engaging and emotional, intelligent, but also committed in some way to a moral or ethical viewpoint, to making the world a better place. Then side by side with that, also around the age of 6, I started watching Doctor Who. It was all about, saving the world from various disasters, finding courage in yourself, using intuition, taking responsibility for actions, and also because he's constantly dealing with aliens of different kinds, and some of them are not aggressors. There's a fascination with difference there, that not everyone has to look the same to be someone you can communicate with, can empathize with. So then, of course, the big stage that got me into writing, and I've said this, reading, I've said this a few times before, is hearing my wonderful primary school teacher, Mrs. Telford, reading The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe to us. And I think she then went on to Prince Caspian. But I remember just the sheer wonder and fascination of this story, and sitting there cross-legged on the floor at 7, weeping at the return of Aslan. And yet I have to say, not seeing a connection with the Christian story. And I think that's probably because I was very, very close already to the Christian story. So it seemed, a thing, a reality at this time. Anything that patterned itself in that way was just, in a sense, kind of camouflaged against that background, I guess. And I had gone to, I was at a Church of England school. I'd been baptized. My family's not religious. This was more of a kind of traditional thing, baptism. But I remember my first day at my primary school, going in and finding that this plastic table, which was like a classroom sandpit, and me and someone I can't remember made a little model, a nativity scene. This was actually in the middle of the summer, because it was like an induction day before the term, the semester started. So that's how, deeply drenched, I suppose, I was in Christian culture at the time. And the school held assemblies every day where the headmistress or the headmaster would give kind of sermons, or certainly moral talks, often with Christian reference, and we'd sing hymns. And that went on all the way through my school years until I was 16. So that's the background. And of course, you might think, therefore, that Narnia would, cement my Christianity. But as I say, I didn't even get that it was a Christian text until quite a bit later. Then a further one, I'll try to accelerate a bit here. These are marvelous books by a Swedish-speaking Finn, Tove Jansson. The Moomin books, which are magical, wondrous, and have they just teach a curiosity, fellowship, difference again. People are always, as in this one, Comet in Moominland, narrowly escaping disaster with the help of their friends and their ingenuity. And these are also written. These are written. They were begun in the Second World War, so kind of similar mechanism, I think, to Tolkien's creativity there. So then, when I was about 8 years old, I was reading those, and then just as I was about to turn 10, I read Lord of the Rings. And that was a quantum leap beyond anything I'd encountered before, of any kind. Film, TV, books. And, I was drawn in by the heroism, self-sacrifice, the natural wonder, eucatastrophe, though I didn't know what it was. I remember the first time I wept reading Lord of the Rings was at Theoden's funeral, which is probably a fairly conventional kind of grief, a conventional kind of tears. But since then, almost every time that I've shed tears over the Lord of the Rings, and it's very often, it's been at moments of what Tolkien called eucatastrophe. So those moments when everything seems insuperably dark and disaster seems almost inescapable. And suddenly there's a breakthrough, there's a ray of light, there's the sound of horns in the hills ringing. And those are the moments where, no matter how well I know the story, they can still set me off, especially if I'm reading aloud. I don't know how actors do this, I completely spoil my readings aloud when it comes to these points because I turn into a sort of blubbing wreck. And the Lord of the Rings also brought me, in a way, I suppose, that, Narnia, but also, in fact, the Wombles did, this desperate urge to believe in this imagined reality. I remember visiting Wimbledon Common as a child and thinking, well, A, the bushes aren't made of cut out green paper like they are on television. And B, all I can see is humans and dogs, but no Wombles, And I knew, of course, that I wasn't going to on a logical, rational level, but it was still a disappointment. So Narnia, of course, I wanted to go through wardrobes. The Lord of the Rings, I can vividly remember, playing in I had a friend with a big garden, playing in his garden and thinking, as the dusk was settling, surely now's the kind of time when I could see a hobbit. And I'd have been somewhere between 10 and 12. So, still my imagination was very, very much kind of almost in control of my rationalism. Another big stage with the Lord of the Rings. There used to be a British holiday called Whitson Tide, long weekend, and my family used to go to a cottage in Wales, South Wales, which was in the middle of nowhere. And I was reading The Return of the King for about the fourth time by then. I was 11, about to turn 12. And it was incredibly peaceful. And the only disturbance in that week was a moment when several military jets flew overhead at high speed, very, very loudly. And the combination of these things, these strangely unalike things, the Siege of Gondor, I remember, prompted me to decide that I was a pacifist. And this is something, I'm almost absurdly precocious to do at just short of 12. And my school friends thought so too. And they very kindly tried to challenge me, and they turned against me and started sort of trying to coax a violent reaction out of me incessantly. So I underwent a nasty period of bullying after that, which I was going to say perhaps I deserved it. No, I don't think that. I think it was very mean. So you can see that I was going in directions that perhaps Tolkien wouldn't even have supported himself. And I stuck with pacifism. If you remember in Tolkien's letters, he talks about Tom Bombadil as a representative of a kind of pacifism, which is important to sustain, but is in itself not enough as a response to the world. And I stuck with this sort of commitment to pacifism from 1978 through until about the early to mid 1990s, when I became troubled by the the war in Yugoslavia, or former Yugoslavia, as it was breaking up, and feeling that there had to be some kind of answer to people who were willing to use force to murder and oppress and invade without provocation. And also the 50th anniversary of VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, when there were major events in London, commemorative events, and a marvelous 1970s TV documentary called The World at War, which was shown on television again. I watched the whole thing for the first time. So I came away from that feeling that there was at times a moral or ethical rationale for war. So just then on into my teens, other things that affected me: Roots, Alex Haley's the TV version of Alex Haley's novel about slavery in the US. Holocaust, which was a kind of rather schlocky TV miniseries about the Holocaust of the Jews in Central Europe during the Second World War. That had quite an impact on me as well. And then music started to come in. So the Beatles, Bob Dylan, civil rights. I became a bit of a kind of, bear in mind, this is about 1980, 1981. I decided I was a hippie at this point. So I was about the only kid who, rather than wearing sort of punkish drainpipe jeans, drainpipe, very, very straight jeans, I was desperately looking for flares to wear and growing my hair long. And yeah, so, and also from these people, just a love of creativity, of exploration, creative exploration, and of a kind of iconoclasm. So at this time, about 13, 14 is when my religious belief, which had not been terribly active, fell away from me. And what happened there was, in a sense, it was stupid. It was because I didn't want to go to church, as being a Boy Scout required me to do. I'd just been persuaded by a friend to join Boy Scouts, which I quite enjoyed, except for monthly church attendance. And I remember having quite a debate with the Scout troop hierarchy about this, and I think my argument at that time was a kind of animistic one, where I argued that, is that the right word, that I got a sense of religious awe and reverence in the natural world rather than in church. And I'm sure that came from Tolkien, because Tolkien really did awake my love of nature in a way that it had not been awoken before, and that's never gone. So that was, that very sort of negative reason for not going to church, sort of fairly soon turned into a more of a positive embracing of humanism or rationalism, where I questioned, the grounds of religion as well as I was capable of doing, given that I was a teenager and not a philosophy major or theologian. So the next phase, I was involved in animal rights protests, and I became a vegetarian about 16. And there was a TV documentary, or a film documentary, called The Animals Film, which I saw on television at 16, and that prompted me to turn vegetarian. And ever, since that kind of period, I've admired writers and musicians who I think are truth tellers, people with artistic integrity. So Joni Mitchell, Bob Marley, Sinead O'Connor, Peter Gabriel, Talking Heads. Either they truth tell, or they've got a kind of artistic integrity. I mean, it's hard to say that Talking Heads truth tell, because their lyrics are often very difficult to really grasp, and designedly so. But, yeah. So there's my. Oh no, not quite. So, of course, the other thing that comes in to building of people's beliefs is just conversation, I think, and so that grew in my teens and on into university. It started out, I think, as speculative. Me and my mates having a sleepover on New Year's Eve and talking about, how big is the universe, what's beyond, and all that kind of thing. And then moving on to just, personal, emotional, ethical, creative discussions over the years. And in university, I was very involved in sexual politics. My girlfriend was a very staunch feminist. We supported the gay rights movement. We supported the campaign for nuclear disarmament. We supported the anti-apartheid movement, all of which I saw as being, very morally worthwhile projects.
Yeah. Thank you. Like, that was, I mean, I feel like I stalk you on the internet, and that was wonderfully honest and vulnerable and things I hadn't heard before. And just thank you.
I'm sure most people, if they thought about it, could do the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that because you asked me, about particular conduits. So rather than just giving a history of my beliefs, to be able to pin it to particular origin points was very interesting for me.
Oh, well, I'm glad. I'm glad we sent that question, Nick.
Yeah, me too.
It saved you doing any talking, didn't it?
I know. Well, we would have just been sucking up air. One of the other things we had talked about discussing with you is how your relationship with the legendarium has changed over time, from meeting it, right, like as you're coming of age and falling in love with it. But you mentioned there are these moments in it. I call them anticipatory tears. You're like half a chapter away. And I discovered reading it out loud in lockdown with my son, which I don't normally read out loud, and I read fast. But now reading it out loud and performing, I'm sitting there going, I'm like 7 pages from one of those Sam and Frodo moments, and I'm like tearing up, and my son's like, what is your problem? I'm like, don't worry.
My daughter does the same thing.
It's coming, I promise. And you have these kind of moments, right, that in a sense is kind of the naivete of deep joy of your first encounter with a text can be there years later, but also as a critical scholar, as someone that reads it and teaches it, as someone that's gotten to know Tolkien over time, is engaged in conversations with it. How has that the kind of vocational dig into the text and the author changed your relationship with the legendarium, even though it can still seize you like it did, when you're 11, and I believe you said you read Return of the King for the third or fourth time, and at 14. So, so how's that changed over time?
I read the whole thing about 7 times before I was, I don't know, 13, 14. I read it about 4 times in 1 year, partly because it was very good, obviously, but partly because there was so much to absorb, and of course you go back to it. Whenever you go back to it, you find new things. I did want to backtrack slightly, because in one of the questions you sent me previously, you asked me, why does Tolkien work as a conduit for wisdom for me? And this is relevant to the next question. So I think it's partly because the Lord of the Rings specifically is a journey, and things change radically through it. So that in itself provides a model for your life as you travel through your life. You repeatedly feel the need for escapism, for eucatastrophe, for you recognize the nostalgia in it, or just the nostalgia of reading it, like you were saying, Trip. But also, I find how relevant it can be to modern times. For me, it's kind of inescapable because it gave me a kind of what you could see as a kind of early onset mental development, mental and emotional development happening. I mean, most people read this book in their teens, so I feel like I was supercharged early on by chance by meeting this book.
No doubt.
And I didn't study it except in the sense that I wrote down Elvish vocabulary and started to figure out, what the word for mountain was, what the word for land was, and how Sindarin plurals worked and that kind of thing. But and writing genealogies out, right? But at the same time, of course, I'm looking at something and unconsciously absorbing its inherent wisdom. So that, and there's the one beautiful quote that I remember someone saying to me that she thought that this was true of me, and it's Frodo at Cerin Amroth. When he had gone and passed again into the outer world, still Frodo the wanderer from the Shire would walk there upon the grass among Elenor and Nifredil in fair Lothlorien. So I do feel that Lord of the Rings travels with you in that kind of way. I think sometimes I'm surely have done things because that's what I think a character in the Lord of the Rings would have done. I remember someone saying to me, I can't remember why, but Gandalf would be proud of you, and I was, I really was touched. But so how has my relationship changed? So what happened with me? First of all, there's a wonderful quote from C.S. Lewis in a book called The Personal Heresy, where he says, "To see things as the poet sees them, I must share his consciousness and not attend to it. I must look where he looks and not turn around to face him. I must make of him not a spectacle, but a pair of spectacles." Right? Very neat metaphor. So this is basically saying you don't study the artist, you look at the art, and by looking at the art, you see the world beyond the art. So you might think that being a biographer would spoil your appreciation of the art itself. And I'm quite sure that Tolkien might have thought so too. But I began, very early again with biography by reading Humphrey Carpenter's biography of Tolkien when that came out, and I was 11. And then Tolkien and the Great War emerged. It was sort of accidentally in my 30s, where I really did see Tolkien as a spectacle. But more than that, this was a case of an education and an exercise in deep empathy. It was a kind of to understand someone walk a mile in their shoes. Well, I couldn't put on a pair of military boots and walk to the Somme, but I could use my imagination and my historical research, my curiosity, my ability to construct a narrative about these things, to immerse myself in that world, in the world that Tolkien lived. And in that way, to see the world through his eyes, so that he remains a pair of spectacles rather than a spectacle in himself. So I always feel that in Tolkien and the Great War, despite what some people have said to me, I still feel that Tolkien is not someone that you're looking at in the book. I don't find that I pin him down as such. I feel as though he's still something of an enigma in there. But you put yourself in, as you would with a character in fiction, you put yourself imaginatively in his place, I think. And I think that helps to understand, I hope so, because this is what I was trying to do, how it was that he came to write his stories in the first place. One of the things that I realized as I was writing Tolkien and the Great War was how inescapable Tolkien's religious faith is for understanding his writing. Now, I wouldn't say, I couldn't possibly pretend that Tolkien in the Great War is written with deep religious insight, but the music of the Ainu, the creation myth, I could see that it's impossible to understand the workings of the legendarium as a whole without accepting that as part of its underpinning structure. So yeah, that's it. I mean, I'm pleased to be able to say that there's obviously going to be a suspicion with any biographer that they create the person that they wish existed, right? That they pick and choose in order to construct something that pleases them, or sometimes someone they hate. I don't understand that kind of biography. But I'm pleased to be able to say that from responses I've seen, people from across the political and religious spectrum find stuff of great value in Tolkien in the Great War. So I guess I've done something right.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, we had talked about this a little bit yesterday with Alan as well, as like, we can debate, the historicity of Tolkien, or even like the metaphysics that he held or might have held, or even, as it developed in the history of the legendarium. But ultimately, what we find meaning in time with each other, talking about these texts, sharing our favorite passages. When you and Trip were talking about reading to your children and having that same like anticipatory, emotional experience. Like those are the moments that we live for. And I think that like you reminded me of just like seeing Tolkien, as these spectacles to look through, that even when I walk in my neighborhood, there's a specific street that I see that all the houses look like they could be from the Shire. And I always try to walk that way, you know what I mean? Kind of similar to what you were talking about with your experience looking for the Wombles when you were 6, I think a lot of people have that same experience. And it goes into the next question, because a lot of people in the West specifically are kind of moving past traditional religious expressions. And people who are scholars, pundits, etc., blogs have argued that other forms of culture are serving as roles that religious traditions used to. And I think that even the way that we're all talking about it, I think you could make a very good argument that in fandom or community or the text or scholar is serving that as well. But I know Trip and I know a lot of people would love to hear your musings on where people's religious sensibilities are turning. And like for you, Tolkien's works in the Tolkien community, one of these cultural habitations. And do you think that's a good thing?
Yes. I mean, I live in a little country village, and there's a church here, and it's not well attended. I think that the vicar shuttles between 3 churches in the area, so everyone goes to a different church every 3 weeks. I've spent my wife is Jewish and my daughter's Jewish, so I've spent more time in a synagogue than I've ever spent in a church, and I can see, the value of a community that comes with religious attendance, because it's not just individuals gathering together under one roof with a common purpose for whatever reason that is, let's call it a positive common purpose, but it's also generations coming together. So there are whole families, and it can be passed down through the generations, and people bridging the gaps between themselves, hopefully, in an ideal world. So yeah, those things are really important. And of course, we seem to be in an increasingly fragmented world. And you might say, I think we probably would say these days that a big factor in that is the internet, where everything fragments into small online communities. And yet, that was the catalyst in the mid 90s for me becoming active in Tolkien fandom, rejoining the Tolkien Society, because I'd joined when I was a kid but let it lapse, and actually going along to meetings where I met among other people, the great Charles Node, who died very recently, and who was the first person to tell me that he thought what I was doing with Tolkien and the Great War was not a fanzine article, but a book. And who put me in touch with Christopher Tolkien, and who put me in touch with the publisher at HarperCollins, who gave me the contract to actually write that book. And yeah, so important things. I mean, just community and shared purpose, and as you say, common touch points. These are really important things. And the lovely thing about the Tolkien community at its best is that it can include trivial comedy, cosplay. I shouldn't necessarily call that trivial. Some people take it very seriously. And also scholarship, and just the sheer pleasure of eating and drinking together, which is something, of course, that Tolkien celebrated. Those values of ordinary life, which is so universal. And Tolkien's surprisingly international for someone who set out to write a mythology for England. I've said before, I think he failed, but he succeeded in writing one that has global relevance and global appeal.
You one of the things you mentioned earlier, and I responded to, and Nick mentioned, is that you get the anticipatory crying with your kids and these kinds of things. But and I think there's a reason for that. It's much like I feel the same at getting to Gandalf giving wisdom to Frodo that I know my kids will need to hear, and I may not be alive to give it to them. So like when I get close to those passages, it could be for that. Or it could be that, like, I hope they learn that the greatest gift they get in life are friends. And if I'm lucky, I'll get to be their friend. And that's why friendship is so important. And I relate to those passages very similar to, my family are very progressive Christian ministers, both my wife and I. And so I insist on reading all the Psalms that churches rarely read. Ones like where you're like, I don't know if there's a God, stuff sucks. Obviously, it says it poetically. But all the ones of like deep pain and anguish and doubts, all these things, because you have all these experiences in life. And one of the gifts of literature, and be it ancient Hebrew poetry or wisdom of Gandalf and all these kinds of things, is when you share it with a community, be it your most intimate family and friends, or you meet someone that they too know what it's like to anticipatory cry because Sam and Frodo warmed their heart. Then there's this deep resonance. And you may not always be there when you have these stories, but your loved ones that know they are your stories have you. And Tolkien does something unique, I think, for those of us who love the text, that if you come out of a religious tradition, you know it in that sense, right? Like, or say like when the bells start playing certain Christmas hymns, the song will be in my head. And I know it's there, and I know it's the one I sang with my grandparents, and they're not here, and all these kind of things. But Tolkien, I feel, has this sense, and the moral vision of it is one that when you share it with your children, that you're going like, no, like if you understand this text, you'll get to know Dad, and if I'm not here, you'll still get to read this, and maybe you'll get to read it to one of your kids one day.
And you talk about psalms that express doubt. So the Lord of the Rings also expresses doubt. And I think this is one of the things maybe where it succeeds where Narnia does not. It requires you to think and go through. I'm not saying that Narnia doesn't require you to think, but I do feel that C.S. Lewis tends to present answers more quickly and efficiently than Tolkien does. Tolkien, we've got the Council of Elrond, which is a whole, however many pages of thousands of words of how do we reach a conclusion here. what on earth can we do? What on Middle Earth can we do with this thing? And that in itself, I think, has been a profound education for me.
I think Trip and I are both just absorbing your words back and forth, and we're just kind of just stoked on how awesome it is to hear your story, John, and just hearing how, including Tolkien and just seeing your life play out in all these different conduits that shaped you, and even as they've poured into your life over, even up to this point, it's just really cool. So thank you. Oh, man. So I guess just from that, we've talked about you talked about your wife and daughter being Jewish, and we've talked about other religious people. So how do you think that people from across the religious or a religious spectrum can enjoy, promote, and study Tolkien together?
Hi. Well, through the things that I talked about with the Tolkien Society, just it enables you to be friends with people that you might disagree with fundamentally on certain things. I mean, that's certainly true of me with some of the Tolkien scholars and friends that I know. It teaches you the value of variety, hopefully. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. There are some people who read Tolkien who are massive fans of Tolkien who hate diversity, right?
Yeah.
And really don't get it. Nonetheless, I like to think that if you invited them into a Tolkien Society gathering like Oxen Moot, which is coming up this year in September, they would still actually chill out and see the value in all these different people who come along and have a laugh, and have some moments of profound thought and so on. So I think that's the way it really works. It's a very various kind of social glue, I think, Tolkien.
You mentioned that
partly because his works are open to so many interpretations. They are so polyvalent, multi-meaninged.
Well, I think most people I know that are clergy in different religious traditions feel the same way, right? I mean, you mentioned your pacifism earlier. I'm regularly dumbfounded by people that identify as Christian and then get upset. My bumper sticker says, when Jesus said, "Love your enemies," I'm pretty sure he didn't mean bomb them. Right? Like, if it's turn the other cheek, pray for those that persecute you, love your enemies, and then you're like, but obviously what this means is the opposite. It's so like anytime you have these texts where they are integral to your identity and to a community, it's amazing how identities and your own community's identity gets tangled up in your interpretation of text, and I think we see that in Lord of the Rings fandom in similar ways. You see it in religious traditions where you're like, are they're in the same group? Like, how's this work? Like, the Pope's like, yeah, capitalism is killing the planet and the poor. And then there's the others, and you're like, well, how's this work?
Well, I was thinking today actually about, and I appreciate we're rushing towards the end here, but I think we are anyway. But I was thinking today about the way the internet has worked and this idea of fragmentation. I think what's actually happening is it's rather like the early stages of the universe, where it has a gravitational pull to many different points. This is how we get together, right? This is what we're doing right now, and they collide. They shatter against each other. They reform. Maybe they eventually form larger objects that have a more stable orbit. I think there's probably something to be said for that. But we're at a very early stage, and an early and sometimes very fractious stage.
So, as we're coming towards the end, John, we've talked about text, meaning, culture, your own life. Like, we've hit so many different corners of different things. But, this is kind of a fun one. But if you yourself were to preach a Tolkien-inspired sermon, what text would you preach on, and why?
And are the Oxenmoot organizers listening? You know, you just
Well, I do like to read passages from Lord of the Rings when I'm giving my talks, and I do like to think that my talks sometimes at least have some kind of ethical or moral underpinning. But most recently, I came closest, I suppose, to a sermon when I spoke at Birmingham University, where Tolkien, during the First World War, was actually hospitalised. Part of the university buildings were turned into a military hospital. And I called the talk The Houses of Healing, and it was essentially about how you use creativity or reading, imagination, as a way of healing hurts. And that talk started off with Faramir and Eowyn on the walls of Minas Tirith at the point of the downfall of Sauron, where this wave of shadow rises above the mountains of shadow. And Faramir says, that reminds me of Numenor. And Eowyn says, does that mean we're doomed? And Faramir says, no, for some reason or another, my heart feels light. And I argue in that talk, which you can see on my YouTube page or channel or whatever it's called, by the way, that this equates to what Tolkien's doing when he's writing. He would take something like The Great Wave, an actual nightmare that he recurrently had, in which he nearly drowns in his dreams, and turn it into a story. And once he had turned it into a story, it was out there, it was exorcised. It was only a picture. It wasn't something that could overwhelm him, you know. So that's one passage. I always love Sam talking about the great tales in the Passes of Mordor, and the Grey Havens, of course, from this. Can I read just for 30 seconds or so?
Yes, please.
Where are you going, master? Cried Sam, though at last he understood what was happening. To the Havens, Sam. And I can't come. No, Sam, not yet, anyway, not further than the Havens, though you too were a ring bearer, if only for a little while. Your time may come. Do not be too sad, Sam. You cannot always be torn in two. You will have to be one and whole for many years. You have so much to enjoy and to be and to do. But, said Sam, and tears started in his eyes, I thought you were going to enjoy the Shire, too, for years and years, after all you have done. So I thought too once. But I've been too deeply hurt, Sam. I tried to save the Shire, and it has been saved, but not for me. It must often be so, Sam, when things are in danger. Someone has to give them up, lose them, so that others may keep them. So I think that, you know, you could just unpack that for hours.
yes.
And that's the First World War veterans' experience, I think, there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, you know, wasn't expecting your last second reading to bring tears to my eyes, John. So I don't know.
It didn't bring them to mine on this occasion. So.
I don't know if we can end on a better note than that. I just really want to thank you, John, for being a part of this. You've kind of been with us for a couple of years now, and it's been really fun to hang out with you, to learn from you, and to just talk to you. I guess before we go too, you know, we've got links to all your stuff, but is there anything that you want to share or tell anyone in specific to be like, hey, I've got all these other projects, but I want you to go here and check this out?
Well, as I said, I've just gathered everything that's on YouTube where I'm being interviewed. So there's quite a lot there that might be of interest to people. I'm still working on a book that I hope will have a publisher before too long. It's called Tolkien's Mirror. It's about Tolkien's work as a reflection of the crises of his times, and it's about his creative processes, those moments of inspiration and where they came from. I teach for Signum University from time to time, and they rerun some of my courses. So coming up, there's a course called Tolkien's Wars and Middle Earth, which I understand from people who act as preceptors when it's rerun, that it's something they find not only intellectually stimulating but emotionally powerful too. I'd like to mention my Steady page. If you feel like supporting my work, that would be much appreciated.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, John. This has been a complete treat. And for those of you that are joining live, remember the next session starts in 15 minutes with Tom Emanuel, and it's going to be a fun one. So until next time. And if you missed any of it or want to reconnect with it, to be on the resource page later today. So there you go. Peace, friends.
Thank you everyone for your comments. I